Welcome to the podcast. This is Greg Staples from STEM Media and a special presentation interview with Gerry Nicholls of the National Citizens Coalition. Thanks for joining us, Gerry, and being the first interviewee here on STEM Media. Welcome.
Well, I'm honored, Greg, to be the first one, and this is a great show, and all the luck with it.
Oh, great. Thank you. I thought that since you had a previous working relationship with the now-elected Prime Minister Stephen Harper, it might be interesting to get your opinions on the first week that has been as him as Prime Minister. First off, what did you think of him negotiating to bring David Emerson into the government?
I wasn't too crazy about that move, Greg, and I'll tell you why. It's essentially that Mr. Emerson, a couple of weeks ago, was a Liberal, and he campaigned as a Liberal, and he ran as a Liberal, and he launched some pretty nasty attacks against Conservatives and conservatism. And now all of a sudden, he seems quite content to be sitting in a Conservative cabinet. So what happened here? I mean, it's one thing to change your party over the sake of principle, or you're disagreeing with your party over some issue. But it seems to me that Mr. Emerson crossed the floor just so he could sit in cabinet for power. And I think that's what Linda Stronach did, essentially, and I think Conservatives were supposed to be against that kind of thing. So I think it sent out a bad signal to voters, and I think it sent out a bad signal to his own base.
Now, James Travers, in his column last week, mentioned that the Liberal government may have had an agreement on the softwood lumber dispute and that they shelved it during the campaign so that they could continue with their anti-Americanism. Do you think it's possible that David Emerson knew about this, didn't agree with the decision, and in principle, as soon as the Conservatives were elected, decided, okay, I know there can be an agreement had, let's switch sides to make sure that that does happen?
Well, anything's possible, Greg, and I suppose that could have happened. I really find it hard to believe or counterintuitive to think the Liberals would sit on something like this during an election, even if it did undermine their sort of anti-American bit, because this would be a big deal, especially be a big deal in British Columbia. And if Mr. Emerson had problems with it, he should have resigned then, or he should have made it known then, instead of waiting until after the election was over. But I think we have to keep this whole thing in perspective. And while I am critical of what Stephen Harper did with the Emerson deal, it's not the be-all and end-all of his political party. We have to wait and see over the next few weeks, over the next few months, what kind of policies the Conservatives introduce to make government better, to make it more honest, to make government more efficient. So we'll have to withhold judgment for a while to see exactly what kind of policies the government's going to be introducing.
Well, a lot of people have said that this move, that Stephen Harper is a long-term thinker and is very strategic in the way that he arranges things, and that there's probably something more going on there. Would you have any insight in having worked with him that you could think what the long-term strategy is behind this?
Well, I agree that Stephen is a tactical thinker. He is a strategic thinker. Because in my years of working for him, that's one thing I really was awestruck by, was his ability to think ahead. If politics was like a chess game, Stephen was always thinking 5, 6, 7 moves ahead. So I'm sure he has thought this through, and I'm sure he is looking at some end game, and I'm sure he thinks it's going to be worth all the sort of negative reaction he got last week. What that end game is, I don't know, and I wish he'd do a better job of explaining it. Or better yet, I wish he would have sort of, allowed, just been seen fit to have Conservatives in his cabinet.
Well, yeah, this is the thing with this is that it did sort of alienate the typical Conservative base, and I was wondering on your opinion of the Michael Fortier appointment to Senate and then to Cabinet. In some respects, I think that might be even a little bit worse because of Stephen Harper's well-known positions on Senate. So what did you think of that one?
Well, I'm willing to cut Stephen more slack on the Fortier thing than on the Emerson floor crossing. He decided for whatever reason, for whatever political reason, that he needed somebody from Montreal in his cabinet. Appointing somebody to the Senate to get that representation is sort of a time-honored tradition that's been done before. And, there is no mechanism in place to elect senators in Quebec. So I'm willing to cut him some slack in that. And we also have to remember an important point, that he did say that Mr. Fortier would resign and run for the House of Commons. And at least, Greg, Mr. Fortier is a Conservative, unlike David Emerson.
Now, does it matter that he was co-chair of the campaign and that he has a lot of inside knowledge of the Conservative Party? It may reek of a little bit of cronyism.
There might be some element of that to it, but I think Stephen wanted somebody he could trust in that position and somebody he knew very well in that position. And Mr. Fortier was probably the guy that he decided would be the best for the job. And I think we have to give the Prime Minister the benefit of the doubt on that one.
The other concern, of course, with his appointment is that he cannot answer questions in the House of Commons, being that he's in the Senate, and I guess that will fall to James Moore. But the problem in being Public Works, where we've had all these problems over the last, 10, 15 years, that you have an unaccountable member there. What do you think of that?
Well, there's some truth to that as well, but, this is not the 19th century anymore. The question period isn't the only opportunity to keep people accountable. There are talk shows, there's news reporters, there's news conferences, and all that kind of thing. So I think there will be an opportunity to keep these guys accountable.
Now, you had mentioned that there's no mechanism in place right now to elect a Quebec senator. Now, I'm not that familiar with Senate reform as a topic, and it seems to me that since the Senate is a federal body, that the federal government would be able to set the rules towards an election on the Senate. Is that not the case?
Well, I think to change the Senate would require some kind of constitutional amendment, which would be very difficult to get. I think it's something which we have to work towards. I think the Senate definitely needs some kind of reform. We need to inject some kind of democracy into the Senate, but it's going to be a difficult thing to do. And now, until that has happened, one thing that has occurred is that Alberta has been actually electing people to the Senate. They've actually had elections and elected people who should be sitting in the Senate. Now, the Prime Minister up till now has been ignoring those elections, essentially turning his back or shunning Alberta's Senate elections and appointing anybody he wants to. Stephen Harper has an opportunity, on the other hand, to listen to those elections and appoint people to the Senate who have been elected. And he also has an opportunity to encourage other provinces to have special Senate elections for those people who are going to fill vacant Senate seats. So he has an opportunity to bring about some reforms, bring about some democracy in the Senate without touching the Constitution. However, I think in the long run, we're going to have to deal with this question once and for all and figure out what we're going to do with the upper house.
Are you in favor of a Triple E Senate?
The Triple E Senate, which is equal, effective, and elected, I think that's the way to go. Exactly how it would look or what kind of mechanism it would employ, I think there has to be a lot of work done on that to figure out how this is exactly going to work in our system, in our federal system. But something has to be done certainly to make it more democratic and more equal and more effective so that it does provide some kind of representation for the regions and also provides a sober second thought. I mean, that's what the Senate was supposed to be. And unfortunately, it's become just sort of a house of pork and patronage with no real legitimacy for Canadians. So I think this is long overdue.
Now, would you tie that into electoral reform in, say, proportional representation, or are you in favor of that or not in favor of that?
We really haven't come out with a position on rep by pop as opposed to the first past the post system. I can see pros and cons to everyone. I'm more at both policies. I'm more concerned not so much with process, but with the government. I don't care how you elect the government. I think we have to make sure that governments are accountable, that governments are honest, and I think that's the main thing we have to be worried about. At least that's what we at the National Citizens Coalition are worried about.
Now, going back to the provinces setting up the elections, why is it that the provinces have to set up the elections for the Senate right now?
Well, I think that's just sort of an easy way to get around the fact that it's very difficult to change the Constitution to bring about a democratic Senate. So what the Prime Minister can say is, look, Alberta, you have a vacancy for the Senate. Hold an election. Whoever wins that election, I will agree to appoint to the Senate. It's a pretty easy way to do it, and it has worked in the past. Back in 1989, Stan Waters from Alberta was elected, and he was appointed to the Senate by Brian Mulroney, who was then Prime Minister. He's the only senator who has ever actually been elected. After that, though, the Prime Ministers more or less forgot about that sort of precedent, and Alberta keeps holding these Senate elections, and these senators are never appointed. And that's largely because the Liberal Prime Ministers didn't really want to get involved in that. Prime Minister Stephen Harper has an opportunity to change that and say, look, if you elect a senator, I will appoint them. And I think that's something that people are looking for him to do in terms of making government more accountable.
One of the other things that's been getting a lot of talk in the blogosphere and the newspapers and such is the key 5 planks that Stephen Harper presented in the election campaign. It seems to me that 4 of them are going to be quite easy to pass. The 5th one being the daycare program is going to be a little bit more difficult. If not, at this point, it looks like he's probably going to have to compromise on that one quite a bit. What do you think of that, Gerry?
I think that's a pretty fair appraisal of what's going to happen. I think, Stephen, some of his policies, like cutting the GST, I think that's going to be easy to get through. His policies to reform government, I think he's going to find a lot of support on that. I think the voters sent a pretty clear message on January 23rd, and is that they want change, and they want reforms, and they want honest, better government. And I think they want this government to provide them with those reforms and policies right now. And I would not want to be any political party in the opposition that stood up against any of those changes. So I think he has an opportunity to really do some good things here in the next few months. And also remember, as we said earlier, Stephen is a brilliant tactician. And I think the situation in the House of Commons right now plays to that strength. And I think he will have a good sense of how to maneuver through the House of Commons and how to make deals and how to set one party up against the other or try to get people on side for some of his proposals. I think he's going to approach it issue by issue and try to sort of set up little coalitions with each issue.
Do you think he's going to have to keep the Liberal agreements in place with the provinces on their daycare program and put that on top of the choice and child care allowance, or do you think he can actually get away with canceling those agreements?
Well, I guess this is where we'll see what kind of leadership skills he has. I would like him to do the latter. I would like him to push through his proposal because I think it's a good one, and I think it's one that people can relate to, and I think it's something he could sell, not only to the Canadian voters, but I think he could sell it to the provincial premiers too, because I think it's a plan that does make sense.
Well, great. Thank you very much for your time, Gerry Nicholls of the National Citizens Coalition. It's great to have you on board here, and like I said, the very first interview here on the podcast. So thanks again.
Oh, you're welcome, Greg.